Welcome to the 29th Miami Jewish Film Festival, the largest Jewish film festival in the world. I want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. My name is Vladi Yurovsky, and I am excited to be facilitating a virtual conversation with director James Freedman from the movie Charles Grodin, Rebel with a Cause, which is premiering at this year's festival. James, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Vlad. And thank the Miami Jewish Film Festival.
Absolutely. James, can you tell us a little bit about yourself just to get started? Where are you from? Where have you lived? How you got into the filmmaking and directing world?
I grew up in New York, and I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and then got my master's degree in documentary filmmaking from Stanford. And then I never used it for about 30 years, whatever, longer than that. And I became a writer in Hollywood. I wrote for feature scripts for Fox, for Warner Brothers, TV shows, Sybil, with Sybil Shepherd, and Coach, and a whole bunch of other things. I wrote about 12 television pilots. And my first film was Glickman, which was about Marty Glickman, who was a famous New York sportscaster who was one of two Jewish runners not allowed to run in the 1936 Olympics. I think your festival showed that film. It aired on HBO and was executive produced by Martin Scorsese. And then my second film, Carl Laemmle, I don't remember if that was shown at your festival or not. It might have been. That was made with a grant from Steven Spielberg's foundation. And that was about the man who founded Universal Pictures and saved over 300 Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. And Charles Grodin, Rebel with a Cause, is my third film. And what they all have in common is they're all stories. This was never deliberate. It's just I find stories that I really want to tell. They're all stories about Jewish American heroes and who were very successful in their careers, but then had this other almost supermenschy side to them that in Charles Grodin's case, social justice and prison reform. In Carl Laemmle's case, as I mentioned, getting all those Jewish refugees out of Nazi Germany. So everybody, all those three people have a very similar theme that runs through the movies. And it wasn't deliberate, it just happened.
So that was actually a good lead into my next question because obviously we know Charles grew up in a Jewish family in Pittsburgh. How much of a role do you think the upbringing or cultural background came up in your research from the early days? And then what impact ultimately do you think it had on the rest of his life and the social justice work that he did?
Well, I mean, he was raised in a Jewish household, as you said, and the idea of tikkun olam, you save one life, you save the world, or you make the world a better place, was absolutely within him. As you've seen in the movie, he was thinking about social justice when he was the president of his high school class, and in 1953 or whenever that was, before civil rights and the Brown versus the Board of Education. So he was always involved with that. And he was going to go to journalism school, but he saw Elizabeth Taylor in A Place in the Sun, and he went into acting. But it never left him. And all through the movie, you see when he's making the Simon and Garfunkel special, his social justice, and it's always there. It's just when he retired from acting for a while and did his talk show on CNBC, he then had the time to really pursue helping people. And like I said, this is a guy who every week went to the prison to be with these women and to let them know they weren't alone and to help them. And I feel that, his relationship with his father and being at odds with him over not working with his store and then the father dying. I've spoken to Charles Grodin's wife, Alyssa, as well as his daughter, Marion, who are both in the film. And they believe, as I do, that spurred him because he was a workaholic, Charles Grodin. He was always writing, he was always, working. And we think that spurred him not just in his work, but in his social justice work to prove to his father, I wasn't a lazy bum. I just didn't want to work in the store. I was a teenager or a kid. I wanted to play ball, and I really think that had that effect on him.
I think, even earlier than that, I mean, the early on in the movie, his bar mitzvah speech is featured, right? And the highlighted that important line of, "I shall do my share in helping to build a glorious future," right? It sets a foundation at a very early age. Um, did you purposely uh, put that so early in the movie to kind of frame the activism in this specific light?
Absolutely, for two reasons. One was that, and also, as he says, he heard applause, and that his bar mitzvah was in 1948 when the state of Israel had just come into existence. So that's partially why he heard the applause, with what he was saying. And absolutely, that's honestly, when you make these films, there's nothing in there that's not deliberate. Everything is put in there for a reason, and you may not know it at the time you're seeing it. It's kind of why I like the chapter headings. They tell you a little something, you don't quite know what it is, and then somewhere throughout the chapter you learn what that means. I just kind of like bringing the audience along. It's almost like a fun little thing. That's all.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you see it, looking back at the beginning, after seeing the entirety of the movie, looking back, you start to see those little hints of things that are going to happen. So
Yeah,
that was
you're planting seeds, and hopefully, when you get to the end of the film, everything has blossomed and
right.
the audience understands everything. I mean, I've seen it with an audience, maybe 15, 20 times, and at three of the screenings, we had three of the women who got out of prison in Washington and in New York and in LA. And I have to tell you something, it was so emotional to have these women there watching this story about the man who got them out of prison. And I can't say enough about what an emotional evening that was, not just for me and the women, but the audience.
Sure. And given the time frame when Charles was growing up, and as you just mentioned, the founding of the state of Israel, he was, of age to see it happen. Um, from a I guess direction of the folks that he tried to, and he did successfully in many cases help. Do you think that his sense of fairness and like the impulse to help marginalized people was shaped by the Jewish historical or cultural memory, given the time frame and the period of time in which he grew up, being so close to so many world events?
Mostly, yes. And then there was also something within him because, how many of us would go every week to a prison? It was emotionally so draining, and he'd bring friends or family, and they'd go 1 week, and they couldn't. It wasn't easy for them to go back. It was just too, as Julian Schlossberg says in the film, Chuck would go visit him because he lived near the prison, and he was emotionally wrecked.
It must have been difficult.
I, that's not easy stuff, especially when you see how slow the wheels of justice operate. They
Yeah.
basically don't operate at all in those cases unless someone like Charles Grodin is pushing it forward.
So, as the director, did that influence you? Did uncovering all of these things um, influence you in the sense of how you viewed the intersection between social justice and cultural identity in some way?
No, because I had made these other films that had similar things. Well, you make Carl Laemmle, and it's a very similar theme about one man doing, an enormous amount to help people. So I've always felt that. I've always believed in the idea of Tikkun Olam, no matter how small, people help in whatever way they can help, and you don't have to do something so big. But what Charles Grodin's message is I'm just one guy, and I, was able to do all this, and it has a cost, and there's no question about it. but you don't even have to do all that. You can do, there can be an elderly neighbor you live near, and you can just check in on them and see how they're doing, or you can bring food to someone who can't get out, a friend, a relative, whatever it is. So there are many, many ways to help other people, whatever that is.
Absolutely. What, I guess, impact did Charles's humor have on his social justice work? Meaning, did he approach a lot of these situations, and from the stories that you've heard from the people that he's helped, was he more, was he trying to bring more laughter to these people, alleviate some of the pain, or did it
Well,
seem more of a procedural experience for them?
when it was acceptable, yes. And as June Benson said, he'd be in her cell and they'd cry together, or but if the story of Jonathan Alter, where he was trying to make him laugh, the man who had the um, a brain tumor, and he Grodin was somebody who was constantly giving people information. I know Paul Simon's father was ill, and Chuck was calling Paul Simon up. They were very good friends with, all the time with, check out this doctor. I just read this article, all this stuff, to the point it probably was too much for Paul Simon, because that's who Charles Grodin was. He just was a fountain of wanting to help people, and did many things that I couldn't put in the film. There'd be something like there was an intersection in his hometown that was very dangerous, and someone got run over, and he helped change that intersection. Or there was a boy on a opposing team of his son, in youth sports, and the coach of the other team was berating this boy, and Charles Grodin did something about it, because there's a 10-year-old boy, and you're berating him because what, he didn't make a basket, he's shooting basket. I mean, it's crazy. So he was always he always had that in him. It just was in him. And in terms of his humor, it's just who he was. And one of the great joys for me was being a comedy writer. I got to have, his wife gave me 7 boxes of his archives, and I got to
Wow.
go through all his photos and scrapbooks, and he had his own videographer, and he had, for the last 20 years of his life, and look at all, a lot of those tapes that he recorded. And as he said, it's in the film that, you got to have some laughs along the way, because this is really difficult stuff. So, he always used humor, and he was so deadpan, by the way, that sometimes friends didn't know that he was trying to be funny. He he would do anything for humor. There's a story Alan Arkin told me, and there's so many stories I couldn't put in the film. They're either too long or they got off the spine of the story. But Alan Arkin said he got a call. They both lived in Connecticut during these years, and he gets a call from Chuck, and Chuck says, "Listen, there's something very important I have to talk to you about. Can I come up today?" And Alan Arkin said, "Sure." And Chuck comes up, and he doesn't even talk to Alan for like 2 hours. He's playing with Alan Arkin's young sons, and as he's playing with them, after like 2 hours, Alan Arkin says, "Chuck, what is this thing you have to tell me about? Please tell me." And he says, "Let's take a walk." And they walk in the woods of Alan Arkin's backyard. And Chuck says, "You probably should sit down." And Alan Arkin sits down, and he says, "What is it? What is so important?" He says, "I need to borrow $20." And Alan Arkin was like, he didn't even know how to respond. And Charles Grodin starts laughing hysterically. And Alan Arkin says, "What are you laughing about?" And he said, "If you could have seen your face when I just asked you for $20, you would have, you didn't know if I was serious, was I broke, was I whatever." And Alan Arkin said, "You drove up an hour and 10 minutes to my house and spent 2 hours playing, like, just to do that?" And Chuck said, "Yeah." He loved, as his wife said, he loved to play, he just loved to play.
Yeah, you got to commit to that bit. That's a 3 hour bit.
Did he commit to his bits?
Yeah,
People
I mean,
didn't
even
know
in,
on the talk show stuff, and that obviously gets the biggest laughs in the movie, but they didn't know it was a bit. And his friends who did know it was a bit were begging him not to do this because it was so risky what he was doing. It's not like he was such a big star that he could get away with it, but he got away with it because he committed to it. And as Steve Martin said, which tells you a lot about Charles Grodin, he wasn't out for himself to score. He was out for the scene. He wanted Carson and him to score. He wanted Letterman and him to have a big laugh.
Yeah, all the back and forth with him and Johnny was always Johnny Carson. That is was always it's always entertaining because you could see the quick wit of both of them, really,
Yes.
and that back and forth. That I think that's what kept people tuned in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So not to shift to too much to the future, but given the kind of the situation in the world right now, and anti-Semitism and broader issues of prejudice are resurfacing, how do you think, you know, Charles's quiet but very firm moral stance would have reacted to what's going on in the world now?
I think it's pretty obvious he would have been appalled and he would have been saddened and he would have tried to do something about it. I think it's that simple.
Yeah, fair, fair. What do you think Grodin's legacy says to the next generation of those who want to get involved, don't necessarily know how? And if you could expand a little bit on the some of the thoughts that you said earlier, where it doesn't have to be a large scale thing. You don't have to go to a prison uh, once a week, where you can just help the neighbor. You can it's one life that you're changing that changes the whole world.
Well, it can be anything. My wife, about 10 years ago, maybe longer, she started fostering kittens. And then she went to work volunteering at the Simon Wiesenthal, the Museum of Tolerance, and teaches classes on anti-bullying. And, so if you take where she was, and then you add those two things in, that's incredibly helpful. And oftentimes, these classes come in from Bakersfield and all over the state in California. And oftentimes they have never met a Jew. And my wife is the first Jewish person they've really met, which is very good. She's a lovely woman. This is very good for our people, by the way. And that's helping in ways that you can't even imagine. So, and you don't even have to do anything that big, just anything you do, just being kind. He and Carol Burnett had this thing. I couldn't put this in the film either, where they just went on talk shows and they said, rather than just go and promote our movies, why don't we, because they were really good friends, why don't we just talk about being kind to each other? Which, boy, does our country need that right now. I mean, half the country is basically not even talking to the other half of the country. And that's very, very dangerous, very isolating, and just plain wrong. And and Carol Burnett, they were just saying, let's just be kind to each other. And and again, if you asked him, what did he want to be known for? He's not going to say The Heartbreak Kid or Midnight Run. He's going to say his social justice work. And I had to make a decision. I showed a rough cut to writer director friends a long time ago, and I had to make a decision how long to spend on the social justice stuff, because the truth is, when people come to the movies, they'd rather probably see just, an hour and 25 minutes of his joking around or his great acting, and maybe 5 minutes of the social justice stuff. And I said, he spent the last 20 years of his life doing this. It wouldn't be fair to honor this man without spending a significant portion of the movie. So the last act of the movie is basically his social justice work. And I felt that was absolutely the right thing to do, even though some friends were saying, you should cut that down. I said, no, it's not right to cut that down. That has to be in there. And that's exactly with Carl Laemmle. It was a very similar thing.
How much did you have to cut?
Well, I had 100 hours of footage. So, to make an hour and a
From
half.
that rough cut that you referenced a few minutes ago to
No,
the
I didn't cut any of the social justice stuff.
no, but just in general, were there, because you mentioned so many stories with Carol Burnett
Oh,
and
there's
Pumpkin and
there's
all
so
those.
much, all of his talk show appearances. There was so many. I could have made another movie on his acting and that. There's a story, but they take too long to set up to put in a
Yeah.
documentary. They may take 30 seconds just to set up, and you can't spend that much time. But Ellen Burstyn told me a story that when she was on Broadway, I got a chance to see as a kid, by the way, her and Charles Grodin in Same Time Next Year on Broadway. Still
Mm.
to this day, one of the greatest nights in the theater I've ever had. But when the movie came out, Alan Alda was named to star opposite Ellen Burstyn, not Charles Grodin. So he went on the Tonight Show, and David Steinberg was guest hosting. And in the pre-interview, he said, "Have David asked me about not being cast in Same Time Next Year, the movie version." And so David Steinberg, they're on the air, and he innocently asked Charles Grodin, "So how do you feel about not being cast in the lead in the movie version of Same Time Next Year?" And Charles Grodin plays it completely straight as if he's hearing this for the very first time. And he goes, "What do you mean I wasn't chosen? You know, I was great in the play. Who did they choose? You know, they chose Alan Alda." He goes, "Well, he's my friend, but come on, this isn't." And poor David Steinberg accepted it. And Ellen Burstyn told me she was sitting home watching this on her couch, laughing so hard because she knew exactly what he had done. And so there's so many bits like that I couldn't put in the movie. There's so many wonderful things I couldn't put in. And by the way, for the audience, a lot of people ask me when I do in-person Q&As what movies they recommend of Charles Grodin. And just to give you four off the top of my head, I would say Midnight Run, and I would say Real Life that Albert Brooks did, which was the first mockumentary. There was a PBS show on the Loud family in the early 70s. And Real Life is a takeoff on that. And Charles Grodin plays the husband in that. And Heaven Can Wait, which is a wonderful film, and he plays a comedic villain with Diane Cannon. And then the original Heartbreak Kid, not the remake, the original, which you can only see on YouTube. It's not in circulation. I have a friend who's been trying to get the rights to that for like 15 years, but those are the four I would recommend. And then you can also go and Google his talk show appearances on Letterman and Carson, and you're just in for a treat of just laughing so hard. It's wonderful stuff.
Agreed. I'm partial myself to Beethoven and Clifford, which came a little
Well,
bit later.
you're of that generation,
I'm
which
of
is
that generation.
people
And
under like 45 or whatever, they only know him from Beethoven. And
yeah,
for me, that was like, oh my God, that's,
yeah, but those are fun movies.
they were fun. This other stuff's, I don't want to say, well, it is better in my opinion. You know, it's deeper,
Absolutely.
it's
Definitely
more,
more
yeah, the others
levels.
are the fun kid movie that Charles Grodin totally raised a whole nother level just by being in a movie like that.
Sure. Absolutely. So since you have all this additional footage, a sequel, perhaps?
No, I made the movie I wanted to make.
Got it. Well, I wanted to thank you for your time. This has been a lot of fun. I know that everyone that has the opportunity to watch this movie will enjoy it as much as I did. So thank you for
I'd
that.
like to leave you, if I may, with one quick
Please.
story
Yeah.
that happened that is about the power of film. And I would assume many of the people in the audience are cinephiles and love film. Here's a story about the power of film. So my very first film, Glickman, which was about Marty Glickman, who was the first broadcaster of the NBA, and he was famous for coining the term swish. So a friend of mine is at a health expo about 6 months ago, and he's in his booth and he sees these two middle-aged men arguing, and one says to the other, "You don't know what you're talking about. Laker announcer Chick Hearn coined the term swish." And the other guy said, "You don't know what you're talking about. It was Dick Enberg." And my friend watched astonished as this tall, skinny man from the Sudan walked over to them and said, "You're both wrong. It was Marty Glickman." And my friend was stupefied. And he walked over to the man and he said, "Excuse me, sir, but how could you possibly know this?" And the man said, "When I left the Sudan and moved to America, we settled in New Jersey. And the woman who taught me and my friends English kept showing us this Glickman documentary so we could learn the language." It's the craziest story about anything I've done in my work I've ever heard. And that's the power of film. I want to thank everyone for coming out for the film, and or if you're seeing it online, however you're seeing it, thank you very much, and thank you again to the Miami Jewish Film Festival.